So welcome everybody to a webinar that I'm really looking forward to. That's for sure. I was delighted to be asked to moderate tonight's conversation, Agriculture and a Livable Planet, the transformative role of ecocide law. I guess, like people on the panel, and I guess very many of you who are joining the conversation tonight, we will have been working in and around the space of climate, nature, environment activism for some of us, frankly, decades, absolute decades. And some of you might feel, as I often do, that for all of the work, all of the activism that we invest in these campaigns, things are not changing quick enough. Things are not changing far enough, and we're running out of time. What really excites me about the work that we're going to be talking about this evening is that it brings in the power of international law to set some really serious boundaries around what people can, what companies can and can't do. I think this is a really important initiative, and I'm really looking forward to finding out more about it during the course of the evening. We have some lovely speakers to flesh out what this really means, both in the strategic, the global, and also right down in the local and the practical. Because whilst this is a global initiative, so many farmers, land managers are working really hard on the ground, on their farms, in places all around the UK, all around the world, to try and make a real practical difference. And so this conversation this evening perhaps connects the global and the local to perhaps inspire us all to keep at it, to keep working for substantial and transformative change. So tonight, joining us, we have Jojo Mehta, who is the co-founder of Stop Ecocide International and the driving force behind this ecocide law. Jojo's background is in working with all sorts of global movements, coordinating legal developments and strengthening diplomatic traction and international effort around these really complex issues. We've got Ben Taylor-Davis, who some of you may know as Regen Ben, who is a farmer local to me up in Ross-on-Wye, who is, as he likes to say, a straight-talking farmer and also Nuffield Scholar and director of the Oxford Farming Conference, so a very active and engaged farmer. Next on our speakers list, we will have Paul Jackson, another farmer, an organic farmer from Stroud, the other side of the Severn. Paul's been an organic farmer for over 40 years and is co-founder of the Kairos Project, which is a B Corp providing leadership development services to folk like us who need that additional support. And last but very much not least, we have Rob Percival joining us, who is head of food policy at the Soil Association and the writer of The Meat Paradox, which is one of the loveliest books that I've read in a while and was just serialised on Radio 4. You can go back and have a listen to it on BBC Sounds if you haven't already heard it. It's a really challenging book and a really important book. So we've got some fabulous speakers with us tonight from the world of international policy, national policy, and real grounded farm activism, farm-based activism. So we've got a Q&A in the border at the bottom. Those of you who are familiar with Zoom conversations will see that down there there's a Q&A button on the bottom bar. Please do pop any questions you have in the Q&A. You'll be able to upvote those questions, and that will help me choose the ones that you think are most interesting to ask our panelists. Well, I think we'll just get started, shall we? So Jojo, are you ready? Are you ready to start?
I am indeed, and it's a real pleasure to be here. Hello, everybody, and thank you. I mean, it's an honour to be in such amazing company for this event, so really excited. And I'll begin by just setting out what we do at Stop Ecocide International, which is to develop global cross-sector support for and to actually actively progress the recognition of ecocide, which is to say severe and either widespread or long-term damage to nature as an international crime, in order to provide a kind of outer boundary guardrail, an enforceable deterrent to protect the Earth's vital ecosystems from the worst harms. And this law is going to have a fundamentally safeguarding effect for the planet and for all of our futures. And it's also going to make transitioning to a genuinely sustainable civilization so much easier, as I hope I'll be able to make clear. And while ecocide law is still a relatively new concept in the public mind, it's an initiative that is already rapidly gathering momentum at the diplomatic level. In 2019, no governments were known to be talking about it. Now, at least 26 countries have discussion of criminalising ecocide on public record at parliament or government level via government statements, parliamentary petitions, full proposals of law, and more. And we believe that the reason lies in what this legal initiative can provide. And that is, as I mentioned, a safeguard. So a safeguard for the future of the living world and our place in it. A safeguard for our children, our grandchildren, for the land, sea and soil systems that will provide for them, and a safeguard that no amount of voluntary agreements and pledges can provide. Now, most people think of criminal law as a structure for punishing bad people, but the true function of criminal law is actually protective. I mean, murder isn't a crime in order to punish murderers, it's a crime to stop people being killed. In other words, it's there to deter and prevent, to protect. We use criminal law to draw moral lines and to reflect and we'd suggest that if necessary to help create societal taboos, which are there for extremely good reason. And as thinking humans, we've reached the point where the values we share have quite rightly expanded to encompass not only the health and well-being of our own families and loved ones, but the health of the wider community and the living world that sustains us. And most people strongly feel that nature should be protected. And this evidences a practical sense of self-preservation. I mean, for example, if we lose pollinators, our ability to grow food crops is profoundly affected. But also there's increasingly, we believe there's a deeper moral sense that needless and reckless destruction of ecosystems is simply wrong and actually dangerous. And the legal system as it stands doesn't yet fully acknowledge this. And so finance continues to flow by default to projects that severely threaten vital ecosystems, and in many places around the world also threaten the communities that both steward and depend on those ecosystems. And for many farmers, current business models and legal frameworks may even encourage ways of working that are not sustainable long term. Existing protections for nature, wildlife, and livestock are often poorly monitored, and there is constant pressure to produce more for less, skewing markets in favour of companies with fewer scruples and jurisdictions which have fewer safeguards. So at an industrial level, as we know, this has led to some of the world's most polluting practices, leading to degraded soils, decimated forests, drastic loss of biodiversity, and of course, exacerbation of climate change. And effectively, companies in countries with fewer regulations or weaker enforcement are able to simply externalize costs through less conscientious practices at a drastic cost to the environment and to local communities. But at the same time, the farming community in particular is uniquely positioned to respond to the climate and ecological crisis. In other words, to be part of the solution. And a growing number of farmers and foresters and growers and land-based workers are all choosing to adopt regenerative methods that work in harmony with nature, restoring soils and ecosystems to health and productivity. However, while we believe a fast-growing proportion of the public supports this, many cannot actually afford to do so, since in most of the world, the consumer choice to buy more sustainably is simply not one they have the option to make. And so in these circumstances, to truly level the playing field and require everyone to make healthier decisions, or at the very least decisions that avoid creating the severest harms, the framework offered by criminal law is potentially transformative. So, what do we mean by ecocide? Last year, our foundation convened a panel of 12 top lawyers from around the world to spend 6 months drafting a consensus legal definition. And the result of their deliberations is the following. Ecocide means unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there's a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. Now, this definition does not actually specifically target any particular industry. Instead, it addresses the level of harm or hazard, whatever the activity. It also doesn't create new crimes out of nowhere. On the contrary, it acknowledges that a large proportion of environmentally destructive practices are already unlawful. They're breaches of regulation or breaches of rights frameworks and so on. Now, this definition has landed well in the political world because it sanctions threats of the worst harms while acknowledging and strengthening existing laws, which may vary between jurisdictions. And while drawing directly on legal language that is familiar from previous international treaties, it is also clearly understandable to you and me, and remarkably fits on the back of a business card, which is frankly very handy when you're dealing with busy politicians. And indeed, in the 18 months since its launch, this consensus definition has become the de facto starting point for diplomatic and academic discussions worldwide. It has also inspired domestic proposals in a number of countries, most prominently in Belgium, where the government recently announced that it intends to legislate nationally. And this year, the conversation has arrived at the UN level too. So over the last 12 months, our foundation has been invited to host side events and run pavilions at a number of UN conferences, including the Climate COP, COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, and of course the Biodiversity COP in Montreal, COP15. And there is already a small group of states informally working together to progress discussion of adding ecocide to the list of crimes addressed at the International Criminal Court. Closer to home, even conservative political advisors here in the UK have told us that they know this law is coming, they just don't know exactly when, and maybe they don't feel ready for it, but it's coming. And there's another advantage to it. So when we put this definition, this very concise definition of ecocide, in the hands of anyone who knows their own sector, immediately it stimulates questions. It's like you're providing a lens through which people can look to ask, what does my sector need to do in the light of this approaching law? And that's where the gold lies. I used to be an entrepreneur before I got into this work, and I know that if you want to unleash real creativity and innovation, what you need more than anything is a clear set of parameters. When we know what our constraints are, that's when we get creative. And crucially, we start asking the right questions. And because the human brain is the marvel that it is, that is when we start finding the answers. And I guess perhaps most powerfully, this is a definition that speaks to common sense. Because we are all on the same ship, which is the only planet we know of that can sustain life as we know it. Of course, we may have different levels of comfort in our respective cabins, so to speak, but it doesn't do any good to point at any one country or company and say, oi, the hole is at your end of the boat. There is a common sense kind of understanding that we must all be careful not to drill holes in that boat. And yet, in the absence of a law spelling it out, those holes do continue to be drilled. I mean, if not by us, then by others less conscientious than ourselves. And we've actually witnessed CEOs in tears of relief at the thought that they can say to shareholders, actually, I can't do it that way because I'm not allowed to. We have to think of a less damaging approach and to go to their boards of directors with that. Now, last year, we were gifted a research project with a top political communications research agency. And they did a public survey, so across a wide range of demographics, and they found that a majority of people in the UK support ecocide law the moment they hear about it. So there's a readiness, indeed there's an appetite for the gravest harms to nature to be recognised as unacceptable and taboo, and for that to be reflected in law. And it is going to take a little while for this law to be adopted at the International Criminal Court. I mean, international criminal law is a ponderous beast. But we are already seeing decisions being made differently in the light of its approach, which is ultimately what this is all about. And I think we can all feel that this is morally right. And in the context of farming and agriculture, we believe it offers some very concrete benefits. And I very much look forward to hearing the perspectives from the rest of our speakers today. And from a practical perspective, we believe it is nothing less than necessary. If we want the soils and seas of our planet to be producing healthy food for our children and for our grandchildren. So I'll leave it there for now. And thank you so much. And yeah, really looking forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you, Jojo. That was fantastic. I'm going to give you a heads up of the question that I'm going to pose to you when we get to questions at the end of this. Looking at the definition on the website, which is really helpful. There's there's a word in there that isn't defined, and it feels to me to be the word that many corporations use to get away with their actions, and that's the notion of knowledge. We didn't really know. The research wasn't conclusive, or the research was arguable. And so when we come to questions later, I wonder if we can just reflect on how we can ensure that that as yet undefined word on the definition, maybe you've defined it somewhere else, cannot be used as a way of getting out of accountabilities. Brilliant. Good. Now, Ben, let's have you next. Ben, you are just getting on with stuff, aren't you, on your farm, currently parked up in a service station on on the side of a road somewhere. But I think it's enormously heroic of you to be able to join us this evening and share slides from a car. So over to you.
Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to have a chat about what I do. So here we are. I farm actually in Ross-on-Wye. That's my main business focus. And it was quite a while ago that I decided that actually the way we were farming was probably certainly unsustainable at best, and therefore actually the choice of sustainability was not the word I was looking for, and realised that in actual fact the concept of regenerative agriculture was something that I had to really discover and understand in order to put my soil back where it should be, build soils, build a healthier environment, and actually have a farm I was able to pass on to my children's children, all of that. In the background of the first slide, I'm hoping you can see my my barn here, which basically tells, we try and educate the general public as much as we possibly can about the journey we've been on. And that section in the middle, half cut out by my head, is sort of where we were and where we've been, overgrazing and terrible soil practices, and what's been surrounded is happy livestock, creating soil, following the 5 principles of regenerative agriculture. And hopefully you can also see in the background a slightly healthier River Wye, as opposed to what is in that centre of pollution and everything. And I'm sure most of you are aware of the tragedies that happen in the River Wye. And we have a bit of a hashtag as well of Get On My Land. In other words, we actually encourage people to come and see what we're doing, members of the public, right the way through to politicians. We'll just talk very briefly about local and international. That's something that's actually happened to myself. Whilst I'm a local farmer, first and foremost, I actually am a regenerative consultant that started doing consultancy on regenerative agriculture across the UK, that then fell into Europe, that's now across Africa, Asia, and China, which obviously is Asia, actually, South America and America. So I am now global on speaking about regenerative agriculture and just helping people along the journey. It's quite a nervous jump to make that initial, the initial jump from this agriculture that we've all been used to. And this is the first question I ask everybody, are you a moron? In other words, what's really happened in agriculture over the years, more than I can ever imagine, is the fact that we keep putting more and more and more of these products, these cans, these bottles, these packets on our soil in order to try and produce food. What we're actually finding is that, unfortunately, the more and more we're putting on, the more and more we're degrading everything, including the environment, of course, because the inefficiencies of most of the things we're doing are absolutely horrific, and therefore we're getting a real problem. And I often ask the question, the next question I ask a lot of people when I'm doing these talks is, are you being farmed? Who on earth is giving you all this advice and selling you constant products? It was BC 234 that Cato actually said that we should be very careful as farmers, that in actual fact we should concentrate on selling, not buying. So I think it's over 2,000 years of that understanding, and we still haven't actually grasped that fact even now. And what we're learning as regenerative agriculture is that a healthy plant in a healthy soil with a healthy environment is far better suited to resist pest and disease attack. And funny enough, the more we seem to farm in harmony with nature, the more profitability as a farm we manage to drive. And that is something that most farms, as businesses, of course, is something that is first and foremost at the edge of agriculture. And this just highlights a graph from Canada, in actual fact, where farm profitabilities have really been set since in the 1920s as rather quite poor, yet the people that seem to be offering us advice and all of the things that should be improving our business seem to increase their profitability year on year. And as I said up here, you know, the biggest problem is this horrific calorie conversion, where actually one calorie of food is being produced by 10 calories of fossil fuels. That is a massive problem, and it's something we have to change, and change fast. So on our farm, we've decided to do the opposite of what most, and actually realize that actually where we could replace death with life, things get an awful lot more enjoyable as farmers, but actually the returns and the results we're seeing are just building and building and building. And what we've done is gone back to basics, realized that actually farming is a wonderful business model where we take three free things: sunlight, rain, and CO2. We put it through the thing we own, the catalyst, or soil, especially if it's healthy, and we create money. And really and truthfully, farms need to just keep going back to this policy of what we are. And just remember that everybody that bolts themselves onto this is often taking money away from our business. We follow the principles of regenerative agriculture. We look at the importance of keeping living roots in the soil. Living roots are absolutely essential at feeding the underground soil biology. And it's this soil biology that, when you get working and working well, actually are able to forage for atmospheric nitrogen. 78% of our nitrogen, of our atmosphere, is nitrogen. Let's have some of that converted naturally to feed our plants. But of course, these microbes are able to forage for all plant nutrients, and therefore actually conversion factors are far, far higher, where we can actually drive a biological system. And this all comes from living roots. We also practice things like limited disturbance. And here we are drilling our winter wheat into a cover crop. Hopefully you can hear me over the noise of the tractor. But there is no need to plough and do huge tillage and cause soil runoff, cause a lot of CO2 and all those problems being released from soil surfaces, when we can protect and enhance the soil. It's really quite important what we can do in order to protect and build soils. The next thing we look to do is armor our soils. In other words, where we can protect it, and the previous slide indicated that rather well. Where we have a mulch on our soil, you can see our bare soil on the same day was reaching 44.6 degrees centigrade. That's a temperature in which, unfortunately, the biology in our soil actually either suffers death or certainly suffers to the point where it is no longer useful. And where we have a living mulch over the soil, it's down at 28 degrees. And 28 degrees is an absolutely phenomenal temperature in which soil biology becomes highly active and multiplies incredibly fast, feeding our crop all of this naturally occurring nutrition. Diversity is something really important, and we've focused on this in so many ways across our farm. Here we have a crop of oilseed rape with vetch, clover understory. The Berseem clover is the white stemmy things that actually succumb to the minus 12 degrees. But this is really important, and what we realized is that where we add diversity at any stage, we increase profitability. Of course, the vetch and the clovers and things like that, all able to fix more and more nitrogen for that living oilseed rape crop, and therefore that's rather useful. When we zoom out a little bit from that, you can see the agroforestry plantation we've recently planted across that field, and therefore introduced perennials as part of the whole diversity thing, and obviously give us another income stream, and also capture more carbon, be able to farm with annuals and perennials together, and produce us another a crop that we can sell in actually the shop, the little village shop we now own. It's absolutely phenomenal, where we seem to be able to, over and over, time and time again, find that diversity pays handsomely in anything we do. Here's the diversity of our flood, our flock and a herd. So in other words, why on earth are we not mixing animal species up together with cows and sheep and goats all run together in mobs? This was just taken as a photograph that I thought was actually quite sweet. And and it's something that's really quite important. You know, if we are going to manage livestock and do that, then in actual fact, the best thing we can do with these things created with 4 legs is actually take them to the fodder rather than stick them in barns and cut the Amazon down and feed them. We can do this rather quite successfully, and we can do this along with actually building soils. The livestock we found in bringing in and introducing herbal lays has had a huge impact on the insect numbers we have. And I apologize for the video. I'm actually trying to follow swallows and swifts. Should have just stayed still and they just kept flying past. But what this shows is the amount of insect life that we find on our herbal lay and our flood. And in actual fact, it is quite amazing that the response of wildlife to not only a very, very good fodder for our animals, but actually you can share this with nature, and nature soon actually rewards you with those swallows and swifts and also house martins coming in and enjoying the feast too. And I'll just run through a couple of quick slides on what I call choices. You know, on the bottom left-hand photograph is often a photograph taken of sheep. Apparently they're born to die. Well, they're generally born to die if you starve them to death. And often overgrazed on cover crops to the point where it becomes very problematic, and very problematic not only to the sheep but the soil as well. Whereas the way we graze our cover crop in the larger picture is on the left-hand side is where we start removing the sheep, and on the right-hand side is where they go into. So as you can see, we're protecting the soils that way. The way we grow asparagus on the left-hand side with flowers in between the rows, as opposed to commercially grown asparagus in the inset. The same with maize, and the maize harvests look very different. And like I said, again, it's choices. It's how you grow these things and how you start to understand that this money, but it's soil, of course, your only asset, literally flowing down the drain, can only be a terrible thing. Potatoes, we grow potatoes very differently, lots of companion crops, lots of compost extracts and all these things that allow our potatoes to not, again, lose huge amounts of soil out of the gateway and down the road. Chickens, I thought I'd better touch on chickens. On the left-hand side is our chickens in our herbal lay. They get moved in a chicken tractor every 3 weeks. And on the right-hand side, of course, the terrible, terrible fate of free-range chickens in the Wye Valley. And the photo in the inset is a photograph I took of our river with a huge fish, I think it was barbel, that succumbed to that terrible algal bloom that we seem to be getting more and more every summer because of the ridiculously high levels of phosphate. And of course, veg production, potato production and maize production is often vilified in causing so much pollution. And I ask the question here, who is growing the veg and maize? And I'll give you a slight clue. On the left-hand side is our outfall into this stream, and in the main stream that it's joining is various neighbours that don't seem to be able to hold on to their soil anywhere near as accurately, bearing in mind they don't grow potatoes or maize. So things can be done and done much better. So for me, regenerative agriculture does work, but we need things like Stop Ecocide for environmental protection. But more importantly, we need to drive the change, and things like Stop Ecocide will make a massive difference to making that change. So I think I'm probably done with time. I often say, come and have a visit of our farm. It's always open. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben. And I know you've got to get away. Have you got time for a quick question from me before you do?
Yes, of course.
Just so my quick question is a kind of almost a parochial one. Do you think our government is currently doing enough within the existing mechanisms it has at its disposal to benefit farmers like you, and at the same time to kind of raise the regulatory baseline to limit harms?
I personally, I don't think they're limiting harm, but what they are doing incredibly well is rewarding good practices. I'll be absolutely honest. I am inundated with new clients continuously asking for help on a regenerative journey. There's funding available in mid-tier schemes and that sort of thing. The SFI does look quite interesting going forward, as you know, rewards for planting companion crops. As you know, some of the initial SFI was a little bit. We kind of wondered, was it actually worth it? But in actual fact, it does look good, and there's lots of other schemes that the government are supporting. The farming and protected landscape for anybody within an AOMB is a fantastic incentive to be able to do way more interesting things over and beyond. I think the biggest problem, if I'm absolutely honest, is the communication of all of these schemes that are out there and are available, but you can't. There's so many people don't even know these schemes are either there or available. So for me, I think communication of what is possible would be something that we could really kick into, and that would be really good.
Good. And you did neglect to or decline perhaps to mention the regulatory baseline, whether you think it's doing enough to prevent the harms that you highlighted in your slideshow.
Yeah, no, I said it. No, it's not. They're not stopping the damage. They're just trying to encourage. I mean, it's quite hard. People are nervous of farmers, of slapping them on the wrist constantly and expecting a disastrous reaction. So they're very much trying to dangle the carrot rather than the whip. I believe actually it should be a two-pronged attack, plenty of whipping and plenty of carrots. So I've got no problem with that. You know, and let's be honest. I mean, often I talk about my farm, and the first thing I actually offer the general public when I introduce my farm, it's literally 220 hectares of a very small bit of agricultural land in Ross-on-Wye. We've taken £1.2 million in direct subsidies since 1993. And therefore, I feel rather ashamed if I couldn't throw open my farm and let the general public come and have a look what I've done with your money. And I do think that farmers need to be questioned on things like that. On, you know, what have you done with all this money we've been pumping into you? The answer: cheap food. And as my logo suggests, cheap food costs the earth. It really does. So for me, that's not a good enough answer.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ben. Thanks. I know you're not going to be able to stay right till the end for the questions, so I just wanted to grab you before you have to go to get a few of my questions in. Okay, thank you, Ben. So let's move on to our next farmer on the panel, Paul, who farms just over the other iconic river in this area, the Severn. Paul, over to you.
Let's try and make sure that you can see me. Thank you, Sue, and thank you, Ben. Ben, like everybody else, really inspiring to see how that's going. It makes me regret not having put up some slides myself. But let me tell you a little bit about my background and about the farm. I started farming nearly 50 years ago, and there's been a small break in the middle. And we've farmed organically for the whole of that time. And so I've seen two farms through a kind of 7-year cycle of how they adapt to organic practices, the absence of all those things in bags, Ben, that you were talking about. It takes time for living systems to adapt. And we reckon we can see kind of a 7-year cycle and then another 7-year cycle in what we're doing. We have a small beef and sheep farm on the Cotswold escarpment. We're very lucky, we've got 43 acres of woodland along the top side. And we also have a community vegetable scheme, which runs on an acre of the land. And that's the principles there were that we wanted to get local people involved in producing their own food. And now we have something like 20 families who come on regular days each week and grow their own vegetables on the farm. I don't know whether people are interested, but we started with just 3 things that we wanted from the group and their approach to the soil and the vegetables that they grew. One was very subjective, which was that it had to be beautiful. The second was that it had to be done in line with organic standards. And the third one was that we wanted it to be a community venture. So part of the challenge for those 20 families was to not divide it up into allotments, but to actually work together in terms of how they produce food with each other and off the acre or so of ground that they have together. As well as the sheep and beef, we have a small apple orchard. We have the local training center for the beekeepers. The Stroud Beekeepers Association is in a corner of one of the fields, so we're delighted. We had a really noisy set of bees all over the jasmine this morning, which was brilliant. Rather like you, Ben, we've grown deep-rooting herbal leys for 2 reasons. One is that they're bringing up minerals from deep in the soil, and 2 is, of course, that's producing a healthy forage for the cows and the sheep. We have the fertility on the farm is particularly where we're growing conservation crops, as in silage and hay for winter feed. We make compost every year. And one of the delights of that process is that we see what would otherwise be considered or as a waste material or something that would be washed, in inverted commas, that something would be washed into the soil. We see our composted material being drawn into the soil by the worms and all of the other soil life that we have on the farm. I think I'm very bad at statistics and numbers, but I think we're rapidly approaching 7, 8, 9 billion people on the planet. And I don't know what the exact size, but it is, I think in a handful of that compost, there's probably 9 billion creatures that are doing the work for us of turning soluble nutrients into an insoluble format, which is then taken up by the soil and the bacteria in the soil and the plants related to that. I'm trying to just think about other things that happen on the farm. We got involved with the Stroud District Council, a flood prevention scheme. Initially, the water boards wanted us to construct a major concrete dam at the bottom of the valley, instead of which we've adopted a kind of beaver-like approach and felled trees across, which creates small little floodplains on the farm and increase the biodiversity in the wetland areas that are associated with that. And we also have quite good relationships with the local wildlife trust, but also with our neighbours, some of whose land we also rent. And with them, we're trying to put together a whole picture for the valley as a whole, where we're creating wildlife corridors and habitat that will enable. We are in an AO and B, but we're also next to an SSSI, and we're trying to work out policy that will enable the species on the SSSI to inhabit and grow closer to the centre of our farm and indeed closer to the town of Stroud. Just a small example of that, I noticed that cowslips are now growing something like half a mile from the SSSI, which is really beautiful in a month or so. I think that the last thing I'd say is that, Ben, you talked about healthy soil and healthy crops and healthy animals. For me, this is also, and I know everybody here will probably know this already, but we also have a health crisis. And as we bring people out and as people eat soil grown in a healthy way, then our baseline of health in the local population has an opportunity to improve as well. So for us, selling locally is really important. If there's one downside at the moment of our farm, I would say I'm disappointed that more of our beef and lamb goes to the supermarkets than I would like. We need to find a way of making sure that more goes locally. At the moment, it's about 50%, and we'd love to change that. That's me done, Sue, I think. Thank you, everybody, for listening, and I look forward to questions and answers later.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you. So I'm going to crack on to Rob, because I know that you are sticking around, and we'll have plenty of time to get into the questions that are starting to appear in the Q&A already. Some interesting and provocative questions. A person who knows how to be interesting and provocative all day, Rob Percival, over to you.
Thank you, Sue. Very generous introduction. Excuse me. Hi, everyone. I'm Rob Percival. I'm head of food policy at the Soil Association. We're an organisation that promotes organic and regenerative farming, all the stuff that Paul and Ben are up to. And I've got a few slides, so I'm going to try and share my screen. I'm hoping you can see. Could you just tell me? Can you see? You can see the slide, but not the notes. Is that right?
Yeah, I can see the slides.
Great. So yeah, really pleased to contribute to this this webinar. I think Ecocide is a really important legal concept and has lots to contribute. But I wanted to start with a provocation, a question. What's the value of nature? What's the value of a tree or a forest? How do we quantify the worth of a river or a mountain? And lots of us working in the environmental movement appeal to natural capital to answer this question. I assume many of you will have heard of natural capital as a concept. Researchers recently estimated that British trees are worth 400 million, and this was a valuation based on the role they play in woodland, intercepting rainfall and storing water and reducing floods and so on. And this agenda, this natural capital agenda, I'm really starting with a bit of a rant here. I don't like this natural capital agenda that much. It's a personal view. It's becoming increasingly prevalent. We increasingly talk about the pricing, the valuation, the monetization, the financialization of nature, all in the name of saving it. And there's very good reasons that we do this. We need to put a price tag on nature for lots of pragmatic reasons. We need to get private capital into sustainable land use now more than ever. There's a rationale, but it's horrible, isn't it? Or at least I think it is. This term natural capital is a horrible collection of words. It subsumes nature into capitalism. Ecological processes, they become ecosystem services. We talk about meadows and rivers as green infrastructure. Wild animals become asset classes in an ecosystems market. It's all for human benefit. It's all quantified, and it feels like it's admitting defeat. And part of the reason that I like this ecocide concept is that it doesn't do that. You can draw obvious links from ecocide to human rights or human well-being, to the impact on human societies, but these aren't the primary framing. It's not about us. Ecocide as a concept recognizes that ecosystems are important in and of themselves. So it's implicit in the concept that nature is of intrinsic value. And I think that's a hugely important conceptual shift relative to the natural capital thinking which dominates today. I wanted to secondly give a plug for this book. It felt like an appropriate moment to do so. I think it's a great book, written by Cormac Cullinan a number of years back. He's an attorney and an author, and it's really a book about how legal systems of law and governance shape societal values and behaviours. in pretty fundamental ways. Those of us working on food and the environment in a sort of policy and campaigning space, that's where I sit. I'm not a farmer, a practitioner, I'm in that policy space. We spend a lot of time talking about what governments can do through new policies, regulatory frameworks, market incentives, and so on. But we don't really spend much time thinking about how, at its root, our legal system acts to legitimize and encourage the exploitation of the natural world. And that's where this book is really insightful, stressing the importance of redefining our ideas of law and governance in order to establish a sounder basis for strengthening the relationship between humans and the rest of the biosphere. One obvious example of how important the sort of foundations of law are in shaping societal attitudes and behaviors is probably found in America and the States. If you think about how the American Declaration of Independence and their constitution shape the American psyche and society, these lines about unalienable rights and individual freedoms are really fundamental to the way that Americans think and behave, for better and for worse. So there's a really intimate relationship between a society's view of itself and its conception of law. And at the moment, our law in the UK, in Europe, and more broadly, is anthropocentric. It's oriented towards human rights, human behaviors, and human behaviors are sanctioned in such a way that they can exploit the natural world. These are resources for us to use with rather limited protections. And what Cullinan suggests is that we need not just new laws, but a fundamental reorientation of our concept of law. And this is obviously a really big agenda, but writing Ecocide into the Rome Statute would be a small but meaningful step in that direction. It's not just a new law, it's a reconception of the role of law, recognizing the intrinsic value of ecosystems, positioning ecocide alongside genocide. And there's much more to do around rights of nature and earth jurisprudence. There's a whole agenda around shifting legal systems to be more ecologically minded. But I think ecocide as a legal concept is hugely important part of that. I've just got a couple of slides here that I've yoinked from Henry Dimbleby's National Food Strategy, which is an excellent document, very readable. I do recommend it. But just to illustrate how important food and agriculture is to the Earth's environment, just some headline stats here. 50% of the Earth's habitable land is used for agriculture. We've only got to that 50% figure through ecocidal destruction of wild ecosystems. There's a distinct disbalance in land use. 77% of agricultural land is used for animal farming. Whether or not animal farming is sustainable is hugely context dependent. Lots of scope for the good stuff in the UK, lots of bad stuff going on all over the place. But there is an oversized footprint on a global level. And that can be illustrated in a slightly different way in this diagram. Essentially what this shows is the biomass of humans and livestock relative to wild animals. And today, 96% of all the mammals on the planet, measured by biomass, are humans and farm animals, just 4% are wild. So there's a huge historic destruction behind those figures, and we urgently need to put this into reverse. And yeah, pick your environmental issue. Food system is really at the heart of it. Everything from nitrogen pollution, freshwater pollution, biodiversity loss, climate change, and so on. So that there's lots of scope, suffice to say, for this concept to be applied in the context of food and agriculture. And inevitably, we're coming back to this issue of poultry farming in the Wye. This is a map, it's not a complete map of some of the intensive poultry units that are broadly speaking in this area. They go further south as well, across Shropshire, Herefordshire, Powys, massive concentration of factory farm chicken. and really concerning implications. For the River Wye, for anyone who doesn't know, is probably the UK's most picturesque river. It's beautiful, snaking from mid Wales down to the Bristol Channel. Various stretches are designated areas of outstanding natural beauty, but it's really being destroyed by a variety of for a variety of causes, but the discharge of raw sewage from human activity and the spreading of manures on the land from intensive poultry are two of the primary ones. And the problem is that once all those nutrients get into the river, you end up with this greeny brown slime, growth of algal blooms which suffocate the river. Each of these chicken sheds, remember how many there were on the last slide, is holding 40,000, 100,000 chickens, and that's a lot of chicken manure that's produced. A lot of that manure is spread on the land around the Wye and the Severn catchment as well, and eventually finds its way back down into the river, choking everything that it finds in its path, and lots of wildlife suffering: salmon, swans, kingfishers, otters. Yeah, it's a real it's a real crime scene. There are various business operating in the area. Avara is the big sort of chicken business behind lots of this. It's a joint venture with Cargill. It's a joint venture between Cargill and Fikenda, these two companies behind it. And they've acted with complete disregard for the Wye for a number of years. There's a really strong body of evidence, mainly thanks to local citizen scientists, local activists who've painted the picture in the absence of proper regulatory oversight, but really clear that they are the primary cause of a lot of this pollution. And they're still greenwashing their activities today. They've got a new sustainable poultry roadmap out, which is complete nonsense. They're building a massive AD plant at the moment, or they're proposing to. There's a planning application going through, which they somehow think is going to help address the phosphate pollution, though it's not clear that that's even a viable prospect. And in recent months, I've been working with legal experts to design a campaign targeting Avara and industrial poultry on the Wye. And there are a number of legal avenues that we might pursue to try and address this. You can look at the evidence of harm to protected sites or species, or water quality regulations. You can look at air pollution, ammonia and nitrogen. You can look at human rights, public nuisance, impacts on tourism and public health, and so on. But I think it's fair to say that we're inhibited, and we can't simply call a spade a spade. We can't just say the destruction of this ecosystem is wrong and it should be illegal. So it's a clear example, I think, of where the absence of ecocide as a concept in the legal lexicon is a barrier. Ecocide should be a word on the lips of Avara shareholders in the boardroom. Local planning officers should be thinking in these terms. This is the language we should be using in the national press. And by instilling ecocide in law, I think it would provide not only a novel avenue to seeking legal redress for some of these harms, but it would add weight to existing environmental legislation. It would frame that legislation in a new light. So I think it's high time we got on and did it. That's it. Thank you. I'm gonna stop sharing.
Thank you, Rob. And I, for one, living on the catchment of the Wye myself, I'm very pleased that you are getting on with the campaigns, along with lots of other people locally, lots of other River Action and citizens campaign groups are really taking on the challenge. So I hope we'll come back and talk a little bit more about that as a really good example of why this is so important. But I'm just going to sneak back, if I may, to Jojo to pick up the question that I primed you with at the start, because I think I'm imagining the response of companies like Cargill, just like the oil companies have done for years, which is to say, but we didn't know. The science wasn't settled. It could have been us, it could have been somebody else. How is that framed in the context of an ecocide law, Jojo? How can we make sure that that is not the get out of jail clause that so many corporates have used in the past?
Yeah, definitely happy to answer that. I'd also like to invite those panelists who are still here to actually make themselves visible as well, and perhaps we can pop to a gallery view so that we can all, you know, potentially discuss and take any further questions. And in terms of the knowledge aspect, I mean, obviously the thing with it, you know, with it bringing in a new law is it won't be retroactive. It's not like when Ecocide law comes into force eventually, which it will, that you can then go back and prosecute people for stuff they did before it came into place. But what we do have, the situation we do have now, is actually we have an awful lot of knowledge, of which Rob's just shown us, and you know, a nice big chunk. Effectively, it's not about, you know, those heads of companies being able to say, oh, I didn't know. If the knowledge is there in the public domain, there's an issue of should have known. You know, that can't be something that, you know, they can't use that as a get out clause. I mean, just like, you know, you can't say, oh, I didn't know I was supposed to wear a seatbelt. You know, it's like, well, no, that's the law, you're supposed to wear a seatbelt. I mean, you know, it's the knowledge doesn't have to be personal knowledge. It's a knowledge, it's a knew or should have known. And it, you know, and it does go to those at the sort of superior level of, you know, those decision makers, and I think that's really super important. But I think the other aspect here as well is that, and I think Rob touched on this, is that if this law had already been in place, these things may not have arisen, because actually at the stage of discussing how they were going to, you know, roll out their chicken business or what, you know, I mean, that is just one example. Obviously, they would actually have had to have this in mind. Go, okay, you know, if we make this decision or we go about this project in this way, is it likely to take us near to that, you know, threshold where we could be creating severe and either widespread or long-term harm? In which case, you know, are we potentially looking at being liable for ecocide? And therefore, you know, the whole point, in a sense, is that it will deter decision making that leads to the kind of ghastly situation that we've got with the Wye River. And I think the other aspect here as well is that the real sort of one of the really powerful aspects of this is simply the fact that people can see it coming. And this is something that we're already sort of starting to see some of the impact of. And you know, and governments are starting to talk about that, and politicians are starting to ask us about that. And it's effectively, if you can see that this law is approaching, which is starting to be the case, then, you know, what does that do in terms of, what does that do in terms of affecting the decisions that you make and the strategies that you make? And that's actually the sort of, if you like, you know, in Ben's whip and carrot scenario, you know, that's the carrot. You know, effectively, it is to actually start making different kinds of decisions because of the approach of the law. In other words, treating it like a sort of a compliance period.
Mm-hmm. Paul, were you raising your hand to respond to that question?
I just wanted to add to something that Jojo said, if I may, which is, I think, one of the other things that ecocide law has the potential to do. You spoke earlier about putting boundaries in place, and I think what those boundaries will do will be to force longer term thinking. You know, politics is famous for its 4-year cycle of thinking, and agriculture is responsible for a season-long sense of thinking. And, you know, our biological cycles here on the farm, the regenerative cycles, are going to be 7 years and 14 years and 21 years and 28 years. And that's how we need to start thinking about our food production, so that it becomes a healthy ecosystem over generations, not over just a short political cycle.
Mm-hmm. Or indeed a business cycle. Just going to pick up a couple of the questions that are coming up in the Q&As. Lots of really interesting questions coming up in the QA, and this will be, I guess, really for you, Paul, and for you, Rob. How would we want to see ecocide defined when it comes to farming? I think you've both given examples of the really negative effects of certain sorts of industrialized, intensive, extractive and destructive farming. But I guess we all recognize too that lots of farmers are, I hate this phrase, I'm going to have to use it, I can't think of another one, on a journey. There are some who've been on that journey for quite some time. Paul is one of them. And a lot of our work, Rob, yours and mine, is about coaxing more and more and more farmers to let go of destructive practices and step more confidently into more regenerative or agroecological practices. So what's the relationship between those sorts of conversations and the way we might want to see Ecocide defined when it comes to farming? Who wants to have a go first? Paul, Rob, sorry, do you want to have a go first?
I can try, yeah. So I mean, I envisaged the concept being, Ecocide as a law or a concept being applied in relation to corporates more than individual farmers. You'd have to be doing a considerable amount of harm as an individual to be contributing to long-term or permanent damage to a whole ecosystem. So if you look beyond the UK at soya production in the Americas, for example, the use of agrochemicals there or deforestation, there are again big corporate players who are overwhelmingly responsible for long-term trends, long-term patterns of destruction. So I think the most fruitful avenue for applying the law is in relation to corporate responsibility, and at the same time, as you said, Sue, we need the carrot, the encouragement for individual farmers to be supported to change practices.
Paul, what would you say to that question?
I think being slightly less direct than Rob has been about, major corporates with responsibility for chemical inputs. I think there are two opportunities. One here is that we can bring agricultural practice into line with or closer to the desire in the general population for the type of food and the quality of food that they want to consume. And that's partly about the fact that, with climate change, we're going to have to change our farming practice. And so to bring farming practice into line with demand for food is a challenge for the supply chain, a challenge for farmers as a whole. And I think that's the second thing that I want to say here is that education is a key piece of this whole jigsaw. Farming has a real succession issue. I forget the average age of farmers, but it's something slightly
59.
younger than me, but not much younger than me. So, we need to bring in a new generation of farmers who are inspired by the opportunity to farm in line with not just an ecocide law, but the ecology of their local agricultural valleys and ranges. And that's a challenge for education. And my best wish would be that the major corporates decide to invest their profits in not only realigning their activity, but also in building and collaborating with those parts of our whole supply chain where education will be really important.
Thank you, Paul. Jojo, is that how you imagine it working too? Because farming is quite a different sector, isn't it, compared to, say, the oil sector or the gas sector or the construction sector. Farming as a sector is made up of a real variety of farms, business sizes, enterprises, holding size. I can imagine the risk that those corporates who really ought to be accountable will simply say, well, it wasn't me, it was that person there who didn't use my product properly or who didn't do the job properly. Would there be a way that farmers could be more at risk because of the very dispersed nature of the sector?
I think, the dispersal, factor is obviously something that would come into play. But what I would say is that, what we aim for is an international level crime. So I think, as Rob pointed out, it's for the vast majority of smaller farmers, it's not going to be something that they would have to take direct account of. It is looking to those who potentially, through either not following effectively safety recommendations or being in breach of regulation, which is an awful lot of the time that is the case with the big ecocides. And again, Rob was pointing this out in terms of the regulations that exist already are really not being followed or not being enforced. And the UK is a case in point. The budgets for bodies like the Environment Agency have been cut and cut and cut and cut, and they're not even allowed to, they don't even have the possibility sometimes to even investigate some of the breaches that go on. So and of course, that could be even the case to a huge extent in some of the bigger contexts worldwide, for example. So you are looking at something that's an international level crime. So the other thing is that certainly with the International Criminal Court, which is where we aim, and one of the reasons that we aim the initiative at the highest level like that is precisely to enhance and to encourage that shift in mindset, effectively that way of acknowledging. I mean, if you put ecocide alongside genocide, what you're not only creating, a legal boundary, you're also effectively beginning to create a sort of a moral taboo. You're beginning to say it's as bad, as dangerous, as wrong to seriously destroy ecosystems as it is to seriously destroy people. And of course, let's be real, the two things ultimately come to the same thing. I mean, sometimes people say, should this really be up there with genocide? Well, yes, genocide is, in terms of its intent, is quite possibly the most evil crime there is on the planet. And ecocide is not like that, in the sense that most people don't start out deliberately to destroy ecosystems. They set out to make money, or to farm beef or soy or whatever it is that they do. But the effect, when you look at the consequence, could affect way more than just a people or part of a people. It could affect the entire of civilization as we know it. In its worst instances. And so, to put it in at that level of seriousness is very, very important in terms of this kind of shift in consciousness. And I think the other thing that I think is super, super important, again, Rob touched on briefly, is that what it does is it puts in place a foundational piece that is missing. Now, at the moment, if you campaign for human rights, at least mass murder, torture, forced disappearance, all of these things are absolutely, labeled as the most severe crimes. They're crimes against humanity, whereas there just isn't an equivalent in the environmental sphere. So the whole body of environmental law, which is carried around the world, is relatively new. I mean, it's built up over the last sort of 30 to 50 years, and it's simply not taken as seriously. So, for example, there are some environmental crimes that exist. I mean, actually not that many, comparatively speaking. Most of environmental law is in the regulatory sphere. But there are some environmental crimes. I mean, illegal logging, poaching, wildlife trafficking, and so on. Even those crimes that already exist are actually up there with drug trafficking in how profitable they are on the criminal side and how much they're committed. And yet then sort of the actual dealing with them and prosecuting on them is absolutely minuscule. And in comparison, and in large part, that is because we simply do not take nature as seriously as we should. And so there's a kind of real fundamental shift that we believe ecocide law has the potential to sort of bridge towards from within a system that already exists. So we're just saying, in a sense, on one level, we're just saying, look, just add another crime to this list of crimes. But the potential, effect is really pretty broad. And then one final point is that while I do agree that often it's the biggest corporations that this needs to reach, it's also, we feel, quite important that in the ICC context, at any rate, it's actually individual persons who have to be held responsible, but you go up as high as you can up the chain of command. And of course, having that personal aspect, which comes with criminal liability, it has a completely different level of deterrence and prevention compared to, say, fining a corporation. And of course it also affects the corporation. I mean, if you're a CEO and you have a tap on the shoulder, saying that potentially you could be committing a crime, even if the case never even got to court, the fact is, reputationally, that's going to drastically affect your corporation. It's going to affect its stock value overnight. So it has a kind of deterrent potential that is currently lacking.
So is that direct as criminal liability?
Mm-hmm. Well, effectively, it's being a natural. Yeah, it's basically the ICC apply. The international criminal law applies to natural persons, not legal persons. So it actually applies to people personally.
Yeah, excellent. There's a good question in the Q&A from Fernanda Poblete, who's who's, I suppose, prompting us to ask whether a law such as this, an ecocide law such as this, might help the global north nations set standards for those countries who may not have national strong national laws. Is there value in that? Is there value in thinking that this can, this will raise the production game all over the world simultaneously? Rob, you've done quite a lot of thinking about supply chains.
It's a good question. I guess the example that's live at the moment is around deforestation in supply chains, and there are new due diligence requirements coming in for traded commodities, both at a European and UK level. And there's been this conversation about the legality of deforestation. So at the moment in the UK, we're proposing to prohibit illegal deforestation. But we know that much of what goes on in certain countries is technically legal according to the local laws. So there are loopholes, there are ways in which that ecological damage is being done in accordance with local laws. So there's been a debate over the last couple of years. Do we have the right as sort of northern countries to apply our own laws, to impose upon that national context our own interpretation of what an acceptable pattern of behavior is? I think there's a strong case for saying that yes, we should be prohibiting legal deforestation as well. And I guess this is a sort of roundabout way of answering the question. If we had an ecocide law, then I would hope that we would be applying it down our supply chains to prohibit stuff that we judge to be damaging, regardless of the local legal context, and in such a way as to encourage and support shifts in business practice and behavior down the supply chain to be more environmentally friendly. I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah.
Jojo, is there anything that you want to?
Yeah, I could add a couple of things to that. I think there is a way in which ecocide law can be a tool for in countries where their own legislation, or possibly their own legislators in the case of corruption, may not be willing to enforce either enforce regulation or regulate in a way that actually protects. So it's kind of it kind of could give local communities a layer of recourse that potentially has teeth and therefore could shift the attitudes locally. So that's one aspect. I think there's another aspect as well that is about, actually, funnily enough, is about rebalancing. It's a bit about justice in a sort of global north-south situation, in the sense that while a lot of ecocidal activities take place in developing countries or in the poorer areas of the wealthy countries, for example, the decisions that lead to them are often taken in the wealthy north. And if we're looking at going as high up that chain of command as possible, we're actually effectively potentially rebalancing that situation somewhat by actually sort of saying to the guys at the top, effectively, you need to watch your backs, you need to be being strategic about making positive change, because you're potentially implicated here.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jojo. Dan Smith's popped a good question in the Q&A too, which is references a thing that quite a few of us get a bit grumpy about. And Paul, you've been working in this space for such a long time, you'll probably be very familiar with this, that as things like organics and regenerative agriculture gain real reputational strength in the world, companies can start to monetize it in a kind of quick fix way, and kind of use it for branding, clever marketing, but with very little behind it. Can you see a situation, Paul, where this kind of campaign can just end up being channeled in a particular way, and that isn't supporting people making really kind of robust and, if you like, values-led, principle-led changes on their farms?
It's a really good question, and I think first of all, we have various currencies, and finance is one of those currencies, and it's driven by shareholder profit. If we look at this whole thing through a different currency, the currency of health or the currency of environmental health, then we have a different perspective, and that becomes inspiring for people in different ways. And in terms of, how is it monetized? How is that opportunity to greenwash in place? I think it's a really deep challenge for us as a society, where we have to choose to put on a different set of spectacles and look at, for instance, food pricing as a moral question rather than just a cheap food policy, which is driven then by environmental cleanup campaigns and all the other costs that are associated with cheap food. So again, I'm sorry, I think it's complex, but at the heart of it is we have an oppositional party political system in this country, and it drives right down into the way that we behave between people, the way that we behave between corporates. And I think one of our challenges is to find a collaborative way to approach this for the benefit of society as a whole, and our food quality as a whole, which is, for me, why Ecocide law is such a golden opportunity to redefine how we behave as individuals, as communities, society as a whole, and in particular corporates and government. And
so do you imagine then that if corporates are looking down the pathway of being liable and at risk of prosecution for externalizing the true costs of their business, then they will have to think about internalizing those costs again. So cheap food will suddenly become properly priced in at source rather than externalized, and then that will prompt a whole new conversation about the value of food, how we value food, how we pay for food directly in the basket, and how we absorb costs in other ways. Is that what you have in mind?
I really hope so, and I don't want to end up being cynical in 10 years' time and saying it never happened. The opportunity is there. It's a question of how do we do it? Where's the learning? Where's the education that will actually bring people to a collaborative approach rather than a shareholder value approach?
So there's a very direct question here in the Q&A, Jojo. How would an Ecocide law be policed in farming? Do you want to say a bit more about the practicalities of it?
Well, we obviously sort of approach this very much at a global level and kind of cross sectors. So the deep detail of exactly how it would apply in the farming context is going to be hard for me to answer. But in general terms, the interesting thing about the ICC mechanism is that it has a direct complementary relationship with national jurisdiction, with national criminal justice systems. Effectively, if a country ratifies a crime at the International Criminal Court, it will usually include it in its own domestic legislation, and effectively any ratifying country could prosecute for ecocide. So the ways in which crimes are reported, prosecuted, and the way that those things are carried out in any given country would be the same for ecocide as it would be for any other serious crime. So procedurally, that is how that would proceed. Now, often, of course, we often get asked, what exactly, does an ecocide, would this be an ecocide? Would that be an ecocide? And sort of lots of, asking for examples. Now, if I were answering from a lawyer's perspective, I would probably say, I'm not going to pin myself down to a particular given case, because of course it all depends on the facts, in the sense that, I'll just give you an example. If someone beats you up on the street, it's not the number of bruises that will tell the court whether it's an attempted murder or whether it's just a drunken brawl. It's all of the circumstances around it, it's the motivation, it's the context, it's the exact facts in that particular scenario. But what we can say is that it approaches damage in a different way to environmental regulatory approach. So what I think farmers and people dealing with the environment generally are used to is, how much of a certain toxin can you use in a certain context before it crosses a certain red line. Now, with criminal law, the approach, I believe, would be rather different in the sense, and actually you might think of it as a sort of perhaps a criminal health and safety law equivalent, in the sense that, you wouldn't build a factory with the idea of almost breaking people's heads open, but not quite. I mean, you just, it wouldn't cross your mind to think of it that way. You would think of the hazards that you need to avoid, and you'd stay well clear of them. So, so the approach would be different. It's like, how do we avoid that severe, widespread and long-term harm? I mean, what is the due diligence that we need to put in place? And there's quite a lot work recently been done around improving due diligence at the corporate level, particularly in relation to human rights, for example. And actually, interestingly, I mean, if a corporation were to follow its due diligence in terms of its supply chains and its practices, in terms of fulfilling the requirements of human rights, and let's bear in mind that there is a recently acknowledged human right to a clean and safe and healthy environment, if they do their due diligence right in that department, the likelihood that they'll be guilty of ecocide is very, very small, probably non-existent almost. So, so it also, there's something about it that also encourages that reciprocal relationship with human rights and with the due diligence side of things. I'd be interested to hear Rob's thoughts on that, actually, around what you've been working on with the why and so on. What kinds of how what are your thoughts around that whole sort of due diligence question?
I think it's often the missing part of the puzzle, isn't it? So it comes back to corporate accountability, and a lot of the harms that are being done, both to the why and further down the supply chain through the sourcing of chicken feed from the Americas, they're entirely predictable. You can see them coming a decade off, and these are harms to both ecosystems and human communities. If you trace the soya that those chickens are eating back to Brazil, you can find indigenous communities being removed from their land. You can find local farmers being poisoned by agrochemicals, and you can find reports from 20 years ago saying this is going to happen if we continue to operate in this way. And some of these players like Cargill have been in this game for several decades. They have reports from 2 or 3 decades ago warning them of potential harms which have come to fruition. So there's a clear sense in which due diligence hasn't been followed, and better enforcement of due diligence requirements would, as you suggest, probably prohibit lots of ecocide from happening, or lots of environmental harm, and up to the scale of ecocide from happening in the first place.
And just quickly checking with the Cargill case, Cargill is a privately owned company. Presumably that wouldn't protect any huge institution from action. Good. I shouldn't sound so gleeful, should I, at the prospect, but I'm very personal. So I'm just going to pick up a question as we come to the end of the evening, actually, from Andy Goldring at Permaculture Association. So Andy's asking, how can organisations, how can we create more support for this movement and increase leverage for change? And I might mention at this point too that there's a letter to be signed up on Ecocide International website right now. So that's a quick thing that you can do. But what else can organisations, individuals, community groups, farming groups do to support you in your campaign, Jojo?
I think the most obvious one is that this is about a global conversation, and that politicians, and ultimately this is governments that need to make this legislation, they need to support it. And politicians don't like being the first to a party. They always want everyone to be there having a good time before they feel safe to turn up. So the more each sector is able to talk about this, to use the word, to express support for it, through their various bodies and so on, you know, to the up to the level of politicians, the faster this will move. I mean, you know, I think when we first started out, we sort of talked to anybody that would listen just because that's all we could do. What we've actually realized is that that's actually a concrete strategic policy, because the broader this conversation gets, the faster it moves. So that's probably the number one thing. I mean, of course, you know, there's sort of direct membership of the campaign and things like that that obviously help us, you know, in terms of, you know, funding the diplomatic events that we do and that sort of thing. But certainly you know, ultimately it's the conversation that matters. And it's talking about it. It's, you know, perhaps, you know, organizing events around it, or it's talking. There are so many different things that can be done. In fact, we've got a rather extensive kind of Act Now menu on our website that can hopefully sort of, you know, cover all flavors and levels of commitment. But as you say, Sue, in the very immediate, there is actually a sort of farming and land page on the website that has a relevant sort of open letter that can be signed. That's obviously a sort of first step.
Thanks. And Paul, do you want to answer that question? Perhaps thinking about the work that you do with Kairos Project, you know, how you're working with people to bring their leadership to bear on these sorts of questions. Quickly, sorry, I'm late to ask that big question.
Well, I think my initial reaction to that, Sue, is that the work that we do with many organizations, and for example, we work with an organization that is very involved in the global South, global North conversation, and how do Indigenous people find a voice, and how do they find a voice when actually they're being asked to find a voice by the wealthy and the corporate and you know, it's a real challenge to shift ways of thinking, and it requires us to look through different eyes. We need to have a different lens on the world. So if we look at the world through how do we generate abundance and wealth and richness in the ecology of our planet, our only home, then we have a different perspective to if we look at it through how do I make the most money for my shareholders. So does that answer your question a little, Sue? Yes,
it does. And perhaps a quick mention too for the folk behind the Better Business Act who are challenging, I think it's section 172 of the Companies Act, which prioritizes shareholder monetary value above all else. So, you know, all campaigns everywhere, all of the time. Rob, you are a seasoned campaigner working for a campaigning organization of which I am a member too. Say a little bit about how campaigning organizations like yours can get behind this particular campaign.
I guess we have an audience of a certain size, membership and supporters and so on, that we can direct to letter signing, and but we can also begin to use this language in the context of campaigns and advocacy, and we can try and put it on the radar of politicians and policymakers. We can try and weave it through our campaign communications as appropriate. And I guess that's all part of the process of building some momentum behind it. So we'll certainly explore how we can do that.
Thank you. Thank you. We've come to the end of this really, really fascinating and such an important topic. As we come to the end, there's a whole flurry of comments appearing in the chat that we're now not going to have time to dwell on, but I just want to honour their presence in the chat right at the end. When we talk about people in the global South and Indigenous peoples not having voices, people pointing out quite clearly it's not that they don't have voices, just that the global North and people in power are not listening. And our responsibility, perhaps, and the work that you're doing, Jojo, and other people in their organisations are doing so powerfully, is amplifying those voices, amplifying the seldom heard voices, speaking to power, speaking truth to power, and saying the difficult things that others are not saying. So thank you for this work. Thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for what you're all doing on this call, and also the people who are listening in at home and around the world. I'm going to be following this campaign with great interest and offering whatever support we can at FFCC. All power to your elbow. Thank you all very much.
Oh, thank you. Thanks everybody for attending.
Thanks everyone.